Hi, everyone. Welcome back to tonight's chat with Les Crowder. I'm your host, Natalie B. And tonight we're going to talk about honeybee diseases, basically. And I know we talk a lot about ABF and hornwing virus, but, we want to kind of revisit that with you in more details. And if you have questions, now is the time to ask them. And so Les Crowder here has been doing this for over 51 years, and I was almost not going to admit anybody. He's basically been working with commercial operations, Langstroth and Taba hives mostly now, and so treatment-free natural ways to deal with the diseases, as well as the kind of diseases that we can encounter on a regular basis in our colonies. Les, thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Mm-hmm. My first encounter with a beehive, I was just a teenager, and I put it in a box. I didn't do it right. I cut the branch, and my grandpa and I dropped the whole branch right down in the box. Took out all the frames because we wanted to make room for the bees. And they built comb on the branch, but they did really well. They took right off. I later learned how to do frames and get them to draw comb and all that. And I just figured I'd read a book about bees and I'd read about diseases. But I thought, well, my bees aren't going to get sick because I didn't know of any other beekeepers around, or I just thought, oh, I'm not going to worry about it. And I didn't. And they did fine for a couple of years. And then I went to a friend of mine called me and said they had 2 beehives that they were getting rid of. And I could just have them. And so in those days, I was driving a little car. The first car I ever owned cost me $300. It was a Ford Mercury. It was a Mercury Comet. And I went and drove my Comet to right up next to the bees in the field, set them in the back seat, took them to my house, drove with my bee veil on in the evening, and unloaded them, and then started checking them out. And they didn't seem nearly as vibrant as the hive I'd already had. But one of them in particular didn't seem vibrant at all. And I finally took it apart and looked at the brood, and it smelled bad and it looked bad. And I read in my book about American foul brood, and that was almost a perfect description, where you poke the dead larvae. It's all brown and soupy looking, and it's kind of mucusy. When you pull it out, it kind of strings out a ways. And it smelled terrible. It smelled like rotten eggs, sort of. So I thought, oh, shoot, I got American foul brood. And now the books all said, just get them antibiotic, maybe burn some of the bad combs. The problem with American is that the larvae dies, it turns brown, and it flattens out and it turns into this goo that lays down in the bottom of the cell. And then it slowly hardens and dries real thin, a little bit thicker than paper thin, often with a bump where its head was. Sometimes even with the tongue sticking, like the tongue starts to develop and the body shrivels up and the tongue kind of dries out, sticking up. And it turns black and it's stuck to the cell, like it's laying on the cell. And you can see it. It's kind of, got the shape of a dried out larvae, but it's black and it's rough edged. When you put a stick down in there, it goes bonk against it. It's hard, and you can't get it out. The scale, as we called it, is stuck on the beeswax comb. And you have to tear the comb apart to try to get it out. And the bees can't get it out either. And that's the real problem with American foul brood, is that they get that scale in there and it keeps reinfecting, and they can't clear it out very easily. Now, I've seen bees overcome it, but it's not a good thing to have to overcome. It's like, just a big bunch of dead larvae, and it literally restricts the size of the cell. So they recommended burning a bunch of the combs, transferring the bees to foundation, giving them oxytetracycline, or in those days that was terramycin that you could buy at the feed store. And they had instructions right in the packet of how to mix it with powdered sugar to feed the bees. And you mixed it in with powdered sugar and sprinkled it right down on the bees and on the top bars of the frames. And then the bees ate it fairly quickly, and you re-administered it a few times. And that was supposed to take care of it. So at first I resisted. I was like, I don't want to give my bees antibiotics. That doesn't make any sense to me. But talked to some beekeepers, and they're like, oh my God, foul brood, American foul brood. That's terrible. You got to do something about it, or we're going to recommend you just burn the hive completely. Well, I could almost have seen that, but I decided I'd try the antibiotic, and I went and got terramycin, and I started giving them antibiotic. I didn't see any sign of it in the other bees. And I was told by my friends, just give it to all of them if they're all going to get it. But I didn't want to do that. I thought if it starts to show up, I'll check very carefully. If it shows up, I'll do something about it. But if it doesn't, I'm going to just let it go. Because I was reluctant to use it in the first place. I don't know why. I just had an organic bent in my mind from the very beginning of my beekeeping. And that just rankled me to have to use an antibiotic. But at any rate, it kind of cleared up, and then the bees seemed to never not thrive very much. And then we got into fall. I harvested honey from the other two hives, and that hive didn't make it through the winter. So I was kind of discouraged. And now the beekeepers had told me, well, you have to give all your bees antibiotic all winter. You should give it to them in a slow release method, like mix it with Crisco. And when I heard that, I thought, mix it with Crisco? That's just plain gross. I'm not doing that. So I used the powdered sugar and just gave it to him a couple of times. And then I finally read an article from a man named Dr. Steve Tabor, who had started Tabor's honeybee genetics and then moved to France. He was a bee research scientist, had been with USDA at Baton Rouge for a long time. And excuse me, I'm still
Well,
got a little bit of a cold.
I feel you, Les. I'm sorry. I'm going to buy you some time by mentioning that Monty was commenting that his parents actually had a Mercury comet as well, like your first car. But he said that basically there's not much space for hauling hives, as he recalls. So that's
no, I recently was hauling bees in a Prius. That's not much better.
I remember that, and I remember loading up wood to build hives, and we can pretty much lower that car so low. I was getting really worried about it.
Yeah, that was not I finally got back into a Toyota pickup, but because I've owned a pickup almost all my life, but the very beginning, I got that Mercury Comet. That's kind of cool. I left it and went to Ecuador for a few years. My brother borrowed it, and there were stains where he drove it into a lake, and the watermark was at an angle.
No.
My brother and I got in a lot of trouble back in those days.
That's right. You always say that the bees saved you, right?
Yeah, it was bees. Well, the bees swarmed into my backyard when I got home.
Right.
My buddies were all anxious to take me out and go party. And I was feeling like I'm tired of hitting my head with that brick. But I didn't have any other friends, and I thought, yeah, I'd like to see my buddies. And then I caught that swarm. I was literally carrying it in a one-story length box, and I could feel it buzzing in my chest.
Right.
And my buddies drove up, and they opened the door of the car, and I could smell stale beer and marijuana and cigarette smoke coming out of the car. And I thought, that car is death warmed over. There's no way I'm getting in that car. So I told my buddies, guys, I got to go to the library and get a book about bees. Once they saw what was in the box, they started brushing themselves as if there were bees on them. And very quickly retreated into the car and waved and drove away. And that's just kind of like that's started a whole new avenue of life for me.
Right.
I got to know beekeepers and work for a beekeeper, and I got to be known around the town as my town was mostly people who spoke Spanish, but they knew me as the little gringo that messed with the bees. And so people would ask me to take bees out of their sheds. And then another guy offered to pay me to bring bees to his orchard when it was in bloom. Well, this is perfect because the bees are not wanted and they're stinging kids out in front of this guy's shed. I can take them to the orchard where they're wanted. I'm wanted to take them out of the shed. I wanted to bring them to the orchard. I make a little money, $20, but back then that was good money. And so I felt like, oh, okay, this is where I finally fit somewhere, me and the bees. And that started my adult life, really. I became a total bee fanatic. So I was pretty disappointed when I got disease in my bees. And then Steve Tabor started writing articles about breeding bees for honeybee resistance, for disease resistance. And I thought, okay, I'm in. That's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to use antibiotics. I'm going to start breeding bees for disease. And basically, he recommended killing a section of brood, like a little circle of brood, maybe 2 inches in diameter. And the way he did it was he cut a little tiny piece of 2-inch PVC, just maybe an inch and a half tall. And he poured liquid nitrogen in there, which would freeze and kill the larvae under that circle. This was capped brood. And then he'd put it in a hive and see how quickly they'd uncap and remove the larvae. And if they did it very thoroughly within 24 hours, he considered them hygienic. If they didn't do it very quickly, he considered them unhygienic. And he found that he could breed bees, and he would use artificial insemination to hyperbreed bees that were just super, super hygienic. They'd even throw out healthy larvae. They get to where they were obsessive, went way overboard and threw away good larvae. Or he could breed bees that would never throw out any larvae and just let it fester and mold in there. And so that was one of his main criterion. But what impressed me was, he said the main thing is to breed from your survivors. And then he mentioned that the old comb in the brood nest might be a factor. So then by then I was in the New Mexico Beekeepers Association. I heard of a Dr. Albert J. Cox, another bee scientist from Illinois, that had been studying the effects of old comb. And he found that old comb in the brood nest greatly increased the incidence of American and European foul brood. And that made total sense to me because the 2 hives that I had gotten from my friend had been in those combs, they estimated for 10 or 15 years.
Oh,
and they
that's too
never
long.
changed the comb.
Way too long.
Yeah. And so according to Dr. Jaycox's research, that would be a huge source of problems for the bees. And those combs were dark, they were heavy even when they were empty. Like you would lift the comb, it didn't have any honey in it, no brood in it, and it'd be very heavy. And so those bees were dealing with a big fungal and bacterial load in the walls of the comb. And that greatly decreases their brood rearing activity. It greatly increases the likelihood of them getting all the brood diseases, sac brood, chalk brood, foul brood, etc. So that made a lot of sense to me. So I started just trying to cull comb and get them to build up into the super, and then give them super combs and pull the combs, the old brood combs off to the side, let them hatch any brood out. In those days, I just threw them away. I saved the frame if it was salvageable. Put new foundation in it. In those days, it was wired beeswax foundation. We didn't have plastic foundation, and I wouldn't have liked it I never liked it. When it came out, I didn't like plastic foundation. But now I don't like foundation, period. Because I've come to the realization that bees don't build uniform size of comb, and they like the freedom to build drone comb, small and large cell, and they like to raise their bee larvae in different parts of the comb. And by constantly culling comb, I can help keep the bees much healthier. And nowadays, of course, we have the added factor that the comb is steadily absorbing pesticides from the outside, and that needs to be constantly pushed through the hive and gotten rid of, because we don't want to accumulate pesticides in the beehive. And many of those pesticides are lipophilic, or they absorb into the beeswax or oils. And especially the pesticides that beekeepers put in beehives, often made lipophilic to keep them out of the honey, like amitraz, checkmate.
Oh, that was by design, that they were basically oil based so that they would stay out of the honey.
Yeah, they so when Apistan first came out, fluvalinate is naturally lipophilic. It absorbs it's soluble in oil. It's not soluble in water. And they wanted to make a miticide, they were calling it. It's a pesticide that would not be absorbed into the honey, or not likely. Now, you weren't supposed to give it to them while they were making honey, but still they didn't want to put it in there and have it absorb into the honey. So they left it lipophilic. Now they sell the same exact miticide to orchardists, but they have to stick a detergent, so it's a lipid loving molecule. They stick a detergent piece to it to make it water soluble.
To
And then
carry
you
it.
could mix it in water and spray it in 100-gallon or 1,000-gallon tanks all over your trees. And the beekeepers quickly discovered that the beekeepers' version of fluvalinate, Apistan, costs about $6 a hive to administer. And if they could make up a batch of Maverick illegally, they could put that in the hive for about 50 cents. Now, when you have 10,000 hives, that's a huge difference in cost. You're saving a whole thousands and thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars. So there was a huge temptation to do that. The problem was that dosing was somewhat inaccurate. And a lot of the beekeepers figured, well, if it's so cheap, I'll just double the dose,
Oh
because
my goodness.
I want to make sure I really kill the heck out of those blankety blank mites. And so they were overdosing the bees, and they had no idea what the detergent was going to do to the bees. You know, it's just a mess. And that's part of the problem with the whole treatment paradigm. It never ends, because then the mites became resistant to fluvalinate, and we had to go to checkmate, which is an organophosphate, which was banned, but we'd call it an emergency. And we'd all promised to dispose of the strips as hazardous material when we were done. And if you ask any beekeeper, how do you do that? They have no idea. And so they just throw them in the trash because that's all they knew. What else are you going to do? I finally got a guy from the city of Albuquerque to come and talk to a class I was teaching. How do you dispose of these plastic strips with an organophosphate on them as a hazardous material? And he said, you put it in a barrel marked as hazardous materials barrel. You send it to Phoenix and they incinerate it. How much does a barrel cost? $400. The shipping costs some outrageous amount. And I've got, 20 little thin plastic strips in the barrel that I'm going to spend hundreds of dollars to incinerate. And that's the great solution. That means we get to breathe it instead of touch it or whatever. The whole thing doesn't make any sense. It's not a solution, not a long-term solution anyway. Might be a quick emergency solution just to keep our food pollinated till we come up with the real solution. But the real solution is breeding bees for mite resistance. And that's now been done. It's being done and it's getting better every year. And it's the same with diseases, but we also have to help the bees keep a clean colony. We have to help them by culling the old brood combs and just keeping it generally clean. Recently, somebody asked me about nosema. Now, nosema is a protozoan type microorganism that gets into the bee's digestive tract, and it can give them dysentery where they start defecating even in the beehive. As soon as they get out, they can't hold it and they smear the front of the beehive with their droppings. And it can be pretty bad. It can eventually lead to the demise of a colony. In the old days, their idea was it had to do with dampness and high humidity. And so it tends to be a disease that's more of an issue in the Pacific Northwest when it's real rainy, or in the far southeast where it's just humid all the time. And when there's not much sun shining. So a stormy season of the year. And the idea, that's why they recommend you keep bees in sunshine, and particularly eastern sunshine, so that they get some dryness and drier air in the morning. And I never dealt much with nosema because nosema was not really much of an issue in New Mexico. We'd have occasionally people suspect it, but then it turned out to be something else. And it's very intermittent. And some bees test positive for the organism, but don't show symptoms. And some bees show symptoms and then don't test positive for the organism. So it's a kind of a moving target to try to figure out what to do about. But the solution in America is Fumidale B, which is highly carcinogenic. It's banned in most other countries. And I wouldn't use that either. I would just let my breed for my survivors and try to come up with as sunny a location, or at least morning and midday sun as possible, and clean combs, and relatively fresh comb if they can build into it. And I would not use Fumidale B under any circumstance. That's my personal approach to it.
There's something to be said about, we all have different philosophy of keeping bees. And actually on YouTube, they were just talking about how there was a couple of people that were saying they were glad they were treatment free. And I completely agree with that. There's also, not everybody has the same philosophy, and it influences the way you manage your bees completely, that makes you more comfortable or not to feed, that makes you more comfortable or not to treat. And Candy Jane actually says, glad there's so many advocates for treatment free, because there needs to have, we need to have both, basically. I mean, personally, I think we should only have treatment free, but let's not be tribal here. And she says, hoping my babes make it through our Canadian winter. I hope they do as well, depending on how you insulate them, at least at the top. I don't know if you're keeping Langstroth or if you're keeping top bars, so it's kind of hard to tell, but I definitely will keep my fingers crossed for your bees. What else do I have? I'm sorry, I'm a little off tonight, so I'm trying to kind of see what I'm doing here. Oh, there's, by the way, there's Double Trouble on YouTube. We've got James Arnold and James Arnold. So they were saying that it's like, they should have gone to school together and have gotten in trouble. And then Monty says, awkward, showing up to a party and someone's wearing the same name. So that happens. Let me see.
That happens to me on rare occasions, but everybody, my legal name is Leslie.
That's right.
So recently I had somebody come out and ask for Leslie Crowder, and I stood up and she looked at me like shocked and said, oh no, they made a mistake. And I said, did they say I was a woman? And they said, yes. And I said, I'm used to it. No, we have to fix this. She went back in the office and came back. And so I get that all the time, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
It's called tocayo in Spanish. Somebody who has your same name.
Okay, so there's actually a name for that. That's funny. Yeah. So where was I? And Bruce is jumping in. So nice to see you. He says he's fashionably late again. That's okay. Hey, Les, from Bruce Rodriguez on Swarmstead Bees and Gardening. I want to remind you guys, if you have questions, I know we're talking about honeybee diseases, some of the ones that we don't always talk about, like Apis nosema, and I forget what else we've talked about. AFB. Have we talked about any of the other common?
No, but I would talk about some of them. AFB we've kind of talked about, and it's a bacterial disease that makes the bees, the larvae, it only affects the larvae, tends to affect the larvae kind of late in life, like as they get fairly large, and then it winds up affecting all the larvae at all ages, but it smells bad. It tends to darken the cappings and make them kind of purplish colored, and the larvae that get capped and then die, they get what they call perforated caps, where there's a hole in the cap where there's a ragged, jaggedy looking hole, not like they're emerging, but just that it's got that perforated cap. And the smell is very diagnostic, kind of like rotten eggs. And the antibiotic does, so in my opinion, what it does is it masks the symptoms. It kind of hides it, but it comes right back if they're prone to it. And the best thing you can do is requeen. And that's what it says in the old bee books, by the way, is if you get foul brood, requeen with resistant stock.
Mm-hmm.
So that's simple. It's quite a few bees are disease resistant because they've been dealing with this disease for millions of years, or ever since there's been honeybees. We don't know when American foul brood got started, but we know that here it is, and that there's a lot of bees that are very resistant to it, and you just need to breed from them. And ideally cull that comb in the brood nest Dr. Jaycox recommended every 3 to 5 years, or if you lift it up to the sun and you can't see light shining through it, just set it up in the supers, let the bees hatch the brood out of it if there is any brood in it. Then fill it with honey, and when you go to extract the honey, instead of throwing it back in the super, toss it in a pile, and then cut the comb out of the frame. This is what we used to do, and put new foundation. Now, I hardly have seen foul brood in topper hives. It's not because they're impervious to it. But I think we cull the comb a lot more easily. That's actually the reason I went to top our hives. I went to Ecuador for a few years, and I realized that the expensive Langstroth hives wouldn't work for most Ecuadorian beekeepers. I came back to the United States, and I read an article about a top bar hive, and it gave no dimensions or anything, but I thought that's cool because it makes culling the comb, there's no foundation and there's no frame. That makes culling the comb free, because if you have to cull the comb and the foundation costs you $1.50 or whatever, plus the time to scrape out the old wax,
Oh, yeah.
repair the frame, put the new foundation in, it winds up costing you $3-4 a comb. Well, by then I had eventually I wound up with a couple hundred hives. It became a winter job to take all these combs, hundreds of combs, and scrape them out and put in the foundation. I had to buy the foundation. And I was getting, like thinking there's got to be a better way. And then I heard about the topper hive and I thought, well, I'm going to try it. I built 5 of them and I experimented with them for about 15 years. I built different shapes and sizes, and I had one that was 8 foot long and they never filled it. And I had one that was 3 foot long and they filled it and swarmed. And, I didn't care. I wasn't thinking of them as any kind of a business venture. I was thinking of them as my experiment, my fun thing to do with bees. And I love the way they could make their own comb completely on their own and make whatever they wanted. And it didn't cost me anything to take a comb out of the brood nest, put it in the back, let them hatch the brood out of it, and then snap it off, throw it in a wax melter, get a little bit of wax out of it. And they built new comb, and so I could keep them in fresh comb all the time. And that made a big difference on their foul brood. Plus the fact that I was breeding, I just quit using antibiotics, and I was breeding from survivors. And if I had a hive, occasionally I had a hive that would show signs of it, I just requeen it, or just pinch the queen and let them raise a new queen, because I had a fairly well-established population of disease-resistant bees in my immediate neighborhood, because I had a bee yard I kept bees in out yards about 1.5 miles in both directions up and down the Rio Grande River Valley. So I felt like I was kind of in charge of the drones in the neighborhood. And it was actually pretty easy to breed for foul brood resistance. European foul brood, it smells very similar, looks very similar, but when the larvae dries out, it twists into a little weird shape, but it's loose. So you can shake it, the comb, and they fall out, and the bees can throw them out. And so that's a plus. It just makes it much easier to clean out the comb, so you don't have to worry about destroying the comb with the foul brood scale stuck in it, because it falls right out and the bees throw it out. They just throw it outside in the dirt where it probably doesn't die so easily. It's just spore-forming bacteria. So, they recommend you burn the combs at fairly high temperature. But I wound up not treating it so much as a contagion as a genetic weakness in the bees. And I didn't worry so much, because I figure it's kind of like, how they say that little babies aren't supposed to eat honey because they found some spore-forming bacteria in the honey that could cause botulism toxin, generate botulism toxin. But that's if the baby's digestive tract was anaerobic, which would be the dead part of the baby's digestive system, which would be, there's a much more serious problem already. But anyway, I don't argue with it. But the problem with singling out honey and saying they shouldn't feed babies, that is that bacteria also exists on your floor, on the dust, on the dirt.
Right.
So babies are always exposed to that toxin from other places. And so it's the same with the bees with the foul brood. They're probably exposed to it, but most of the bees are resistant to it. And you can certainly breed bees that are disease resistant.
Mhm.
In about 5 years, I was completely disease free without any antibiotics. I didn't have to worry about administering it. I didn't worry about the cost of it. I just didn't think about it anymore. Really, to me, treatment free is liberation
Right.
from all that. And whereas you feel sort of strapped to the chemical companies, and you know who made the recommendations to USDA for the administration of antibiotic to bees was Pfizer, the company that makes the antibiotic and sells it.
It's
So
always follow
to
the
me,
money.
being free from them is fine with me.
Well, I mean, it's depending on the scale of your operation, it's also a lot of work to do that, right? If you're smaller, maybe it doesn't take that much time, but there's still a cost and a financial cost and a time cost associated and a toll that it takes on your bees, which is another kind of a cost at the same time. So keep that in mind when you consider those questions.
That's a good point, because the bees, when they're exposed to the antibiotic, they use up enzymes in their autoimmune system to denature the antibiotic. It actually is detrimental to the bees in the long run to expose them to antibiotics. The other thing is, a medical doctor that I inspected, an old-fashioned medical doctor, told me, he said, does it make any sense to give bees antibiotic all winter to prevent them getting sick in the summer? Would any doctor ever recommend you just take an antibiotic every January, February, March, April, and then that'll guarantee you to not be sick May, June, July, August, September? No, that doesn't make any medical sense. It only makes sense, well, I hate to say it, but from the perspective of the sales of the antibiotic. And now, of course, we are told not to use it except with if we get a veterinarian's prescription, and there are very few veterinarians trained to check bees, but there are a few that are getting it. But we don't need it. We don't need it. We never needed it. We certainly don't need it now. And of course, the reason from that is that it was exposing us to the antibiotic and breeding antibiotic resistant germs. And that was happening anyway. Foul brood was becoming terramycin or oxytetracycline resistant. So that was, again, short term, it may have hid the symptoms, but long term, it was leading us nowhere.
So I have I'm going to take a little intermediate. It's a French word, so I don't know how to say it, but like when you break the show into a couple of pieces, you take a break basically. Tasha is saying, hello everyone. When using foundationless frames, is the crush and strain the only method of harvesting honey? And if not, what are the others? And I would say there's a couple of ways you can do that. You don't necessarily have to get all the liquid honey right away. It could be comb honey, or it could be chunks of comb honey into liquid honey, which is called chunk honey. And so what I like to do, and I'm going to let Les describe the rest of the answer, but I like to cut out in squares or rectangles for comb honey, and then whatever's left over, it might be misshapen, it might be just little cubes. I will dunk them into liquid honey, and that's going to be my chunk honey, so I can recover the entirety of it. And keep in mind that comb honey sells for twice as much. Like a square here, we can sell at the farmer's market. If we have a following, we can sell them for $45. So there's value there compared to the liquid honey. And the chunk honey is kind of in between. It's like 50% more than the liquid honey and 50% less than the comb honey. Les, what are there? So I'm saying you don't have to necessarily crush and strain. What are the other options from crush and strain to get the liquid honey with foundationless?
Well, there are people that recommend, even with top bar combs that don't have a frame at all, that you can very carefully extract them. If you set up your extractor and just crank it very slowly and go from one side to the other, maybe back and forth a little bit, you could get them extracted. I find crush and strain to work very well for me. When I had 200 top bar hives, I would sometimes come back with as many as 25-gallon buckets full of comb, whole comb, that I would crush with a big drill, half-inch drive electric drill and a stainless steel drywall paddle. I just chopped the comb into a slurry, poured over 30-gallon tanks with a big strainer on top. And that was a commercial scale top bar. So you can certainly crush and strain. Like here we do it all the time, just with a colander over a mixing bowl for a couple of combs or something. And that works fine. I've seen top foundationless frames that have horizontal wires put in them. And if you keep the frames very plumb and the height very level, and so the frames are hanging straight down, they'll build the comb right through those wires. And that does toughen them up for extraction. The problem that I've had personally that I have with that is that they often don't attach the comb to the frame. Mm-hmm. And ideally they would. They'd attach it to the sides and the bottom. And that would make it much tougher to run through the extractor. But I don't think there's anything personally wrong with crush and strain. I have done it on a fairly large scale for many years and still do it on a more or less small scale now.
By the way, Les, you mentioned using the drill, the crushing more like at a larger scale. I have used my KitchenAid with the sausage stuffing, whatever the meat grinder that is, actually. That's the meat grinder. And it's got that vise in there with a blade at the end and a plate for the extrusion of the meat. And I never used it really for much, except that I realized I could cut strips of my honey comb and drop it in there. If it's like older comb, for example, you could just drop it in there and the vise is going to crush it. And there's not going to be necessarily as fast as with a larger quantity, but that's going to compress and squeeze the honey out instead of churning it. So there's that, and you don't have to crush and strain manually with your fingers or with anything like that. And by the way, Monty with Suburban Southbuster, it's saying that he keeps laying his hives, and he's saying he's not using foundation either, except maybe for a little strip at the top, and then the rest is natural comb, and he's also using those wires that you're talking about. So that provides some additional structural integrity for spinning. The only thing I would say is that I found out taking a honey sommelier class with Marina Marchisi that those wires can actually impart a metallic taste to the honey when these people are learning to differentiate the various tones and scents and floral aspects of honeys, and they become very versed into picking up. It's like wines, like being a wine sommelier. And so, but they can't pick up the taste of the metal in the honey. So something to think about, right?
I wonder if they could use stainless steel.
Maybe.
It would help to use stainless steel wire. You can buy stainless steel wire at a welding store fairly cheaply because they use it to weld with plasma welders and MIG welders.
Well, there you go, because the stainless steel wouldn't rust either because honey is acidic. But the other thing I was going to say is that you don't want it galvanized or anything like that that can leach those metals into the honey. Yeah. Okay, so
anyway, go ahead.
No, I was going to try to see if I had another questions, and remind everybody, if you have questions, feel free to type them in your comments and so we can answer them for you. Again, our theme for the night is honeybee diseases, but it could be anything really. So let's go ahead. I'll let you.
So the keeping fresh comb in the brood nest and then breeding for the survivors is pretty much the thing that helps you with a lot of the brood diseases. You know, I've seen in the past a viral disease called hairless back paralysis syndrome, which affects the bees and eventually causes them to kind of jitter, shake like they've got Parkinson's a little bit. And I guess in a sense they do. But that's a very rare adult disease. And that is very easily combated by just requeening. And then, so that brings you to like sac brood. Sac brood is a very intermittent disease. What I found is that if the bees are very stressed, particularly if they get pesticide stress, like if you lose some of the bees to pesticide, they don't all die, then you wind up with a lot of brood problems just from the not being well. You know, the bees just don't feed their larvae well. The larvae just doesn't thrive. Sac brood was never a very big problem. It'd be very few cells of it that would, and the way you tell it is that the larvae turns brown and dies, but it stays kind of rubbery when you poke it. It doesn't get all mucusy like foul brood. The whole larvae comes right out easily, and the bees clean it out pretty quickly. The one disease that can be a problem, and what we found is that it's increased when the bees are exposed to fungicides, oddly enough, is chalk brood, which is a fungal disease. And initially, it was a very rare intermittent disease in New Mexico. We rarely ever saw it. And then when we started getting people bringing bees from the almonds in, we started seeing a lot more of it. And it turns out that there may be good fungus in the bees to protect them from the chalk brood fungus. And when you expose bees to the fungicides in the farm landscape, then the fungicides mess with the bees' microbiome and weaken the natural funguses that the bees have that protect themselves from bad funguses, and they wind up getting more chalk brood. Chalk brood is it's often not widespread, like not every cell on the comb is going to have it, but there'll be a certain percentage. It might be a very low percentage or up to about 20% is the most I've ever seen, where you see that the larvae get hard and often turn into two colors, gray and white. And like the head turns white and the body turns gray. If you pull them out, they're sort of chalky or crumbly, kind of fibrous. They don't smell particularly noticeably, but it becomes a real problem because you lose quite a bit of brood and the brood gets real spotty. And there, what I tended to do is cull out of the brood combs because it seemed that I associated it with the pollen. That something was in the pollen they're storing. It's giving them the chalk brood. And then we saw that it definitely increased when we got bees back from almonds that had been exposed to fungicides. They didn't used to use fungicides in the almonds, but they started using them. Now we're pushing for, they found there's a good fungus that will protect the almond flowers from the bad fungus, and it doesn't affect bees. As a matter of fact, they can pay the beekeeper to administer this good fungus to the bees, to help the bees inoculate the almond flowers with the good fungus. So the bees then not only are pollinating the almond flowers, but they're also protecting them from the bad fungus by helping spread a good fungus on the flowers. That's a better solution than the fungicide, but it still needs to be, we need to check and make sure that the fungus that is good for the almond flowers doesn't hurt the bees.
Yeah, and coming back to fungicides, what happens very often, especially if you treat right away, you're gonna have potentially um, toxic reactions where you've got compound effects of, the treatments that you might be using, the pesticides and the fungicides, potentially herbicides, and sometimes what is taking a certain toll on its own, when it's mixed with those other substances, it can become lethal and create a toxic, basically explosion, and compound the effect of those products, where 1 + 1 = 3, 5, I don't know, but basically it's not 1 to 1 anymore. So just keep that in mind as well when you're um, wanting to treat. Kind of be mindful of the potential unintended consequences.
Right. Fungicides are, they were getting kind of a free ride because we thought, well, they don't bother humans, they don't bother bees, they only bother funguses, and bees and people aren't fungus. But it turns out there's fungus in our gut and bacteria in our gut that are affected by the fungicide, and that is very important to our well-being. And the bees have a whole microbiome in the hive and in their individual bodies, on their exoskeleton, in their intestines, that the fungicide affects. And I think that the gut microbiome is going to force us to become much more conscious of what we're putting on our food.
Right.
And it's also a good reason to wash your produce when you go to the grocery store, because they often put fungicides on the produce to keep it healthy in the store or good looking in the store for a longer period of time. But you don't want to ingest those fungicides. And you don't want your bees exposed to fungicides if you can at all avoid it.
Exactly. So food for thoughts, literally. And then Monty said, going back to the wires, he just saw the recent video about wires transferring iron and other chemicals to honey and brood. He says his are made out of zinc coated, but he's actually still thinking he's going to change to stainless. Les, do you see anything with zinc coated? Is that any better?
Well, I would change to stainless
Yeah.
steel, because the zinc, that's basically galvanized. And
Yeah, so that's okay.
so
Yeah.
that I would go to stainless steel. It's not very expensive to get a fairly thin piece of wire at a welding store that comes in a big spool. People that use it, use it up fairly quickly. And so you don't need huge amounts of it. So I would go to the stainless steel wire from a welding shop,
Yeah.
and then you don't have to worry about it nearly so much.
Exactly. So I'm going to switch back and forth to Zoom and YouTube. So Lolly, I will come back to your question about the temperatures and extra installations on your tabars for your tabar hives. But in the meantime, Richard was asking, do you see these diseases as frequently or maybe less on resources? I'm sorry, on rescues, cutouts, and essentially basically wild bees, non-managed bees. And I know you don't do a whole lot of cutouts so much these days, less, but uh, I mean, I've been with you when you have for the most part, and I didn't see any issues. And then I hang out with a friend of mine who's he's like the best remover in Texas. Bruce, I'm not saying in the whole United States, so there's space for everybody here. But basically, I've been on a few of those, and I have not seen really signs of diseases, except in some instances you do see maybe queenless hives. You do see sometimes potentially signs of EFB or European fibroid. Um, and I don't remember seeing much more of anything else, to be honest with you. Les, what's your take on that question?
It seemed to me like back in the 80s, we saw a lot more brood diseases. And since then, the brood disease has gone way down. The bees around here in Texas, I hardly ever see bee diseases, brood diseases. I see queen problems where the queen is laying a little spotty. And, nowadays everybody's more worried about the mites, and they kind of, you almost don't hear about disease anymore. I mean, we're worried about the viruses that the mites transmit, but we want to blame Varroa for everything. Our main bugaboo is Varroa. And I haven't seen American foulbrood in years. I've never seen it here in Texas. I'm sure it's here. Somebody probably tell me, oh, they've had a case of it or something. But I haven't seen it. In all the bees I've looked at for other people and everything, I have yet to see it in Texas since 2016 when I got here. So I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't look any worse off in most cases, as far as I'm concerned. And some of them have a lot of food. And I mean, they're just kind of the same way we would have in our apiaries. We just are the ones messing with them to compensate for some of this, but we do see similar things. And some colonies are just exploding, some are not doing as well, but I haven't seen more signs of diseases, to be honest with you. Maybe more small hive beetles, because there's more cracks and crevices for them to hide potentially in some cases, but that's not always true either. So
Yeah. The long and the short of it is, if we can keep your culling your comb, the difficulty in the hill country with culling comb is they have to build new comb. And if you have limited honey flow, they build some new comb. It's hard to get enough new comb built to cull the old comb. And so that's with the limited honey flow. I'm hoping that we had a pretty good rain here in San Antonio today. I'm hoping this is set us up for a nice spring. We're going to get a good bunch of wildflowers, and then we'll build a bunch of comb, and we'll be able to cull some of the older comb out of the beehive. And there, what I do is, I just go through the brood nest once, and I check, and if it's a really old dark comb, I'll set it out of the brood nest, not so far that they can't take care of it. And this is after it warms up. We're going to go through a freeze now. But after it warms up in maybe even in April or May, I'll set those dark combs in the back, put my best combs of mostly worker brood, even if they're fairly full of honey, up in the brood nest area, and let them hatch the brood out of the old combs, and then just squeeze the honey out of them and put the top bar right back. Then the top bar, they build a brand new comb on the top bar. And that's the reason I went to top bar beekeeping in the first place, because it didn't cost me anything to do that. And it made it very cheap and easy to renew the combs out of the brood nest.
yeah, so
And
that's
that's kind of the main two things about most of the diseases is keeping the hive clean, keeping the brood nest in relatively, you don't have to make it all brand new comb, but relatively fresh comb as much as possible. And then breeding for disease resistance. Because we know that there are bees that are mite resistant, resistant to the various viruses. So we can breed for mite and disease resistance.
So speaking of requeening real quick, I was reading the Brother Adams book on requeening and how to increase your chances of success, basically. And he was basically, back then, he already was saying that a lot of the problems with acceptance of the queens into a colony that's being requeened is the behavior of the queen itself. And when you're using young, fresh, recently virgin queens, they don't have the confidence, I guess, the maturity and basically they don't have the personality strength to assert themselves, and as such they're not being respected, and very often they're taken out and replaced by the bees. We saw a lot of that this summer with a lot of the purchased commercial bees that we were dealing with, and for our customers, a lot of them were treatment free. We have a large treatment free commercial provider in Texas, but they could have been any kind of bees. And what happens is that when those queens are older and they've established their egg laying and they've been doing it for a while, they are more easily accepted in a requeening process. So I was very interested in that book. It's a very short, like a few pages. It's worth the
It
read.
sounds good. That one thing that we do with that is you never want to introduce a queen and just pop her in. Or let's say you put her in a cage and they didn't open it. So you want to open it and let her out. You don't want to just shake her out and throw her in there because she lands all frustrated and scared. And then her fear and her jitteriness makes them afraid and they bother. You want her to come out calmly and, just open it and set it down in the bottom of the hive gently and close it up and let her come out whenever she wants to, so that she enters with the bees as calmly as possible. And then, I think sometimes too, size matters. A good queen that's laid a few eggs and is a good sized queen, they're going to accept her a lot more than a nervous little queen that hasn't hardly laid any eggs yet. That's just a matter of raising bees a little more queens and caging them a little bit. Let them lay a little bit before you cage them.
Yeah, and if we think about it, it makes sense, right? I mean, she's going to be accepted because she's better for the good of the colony if she's proven well established, fecund queen, right? Whereas
Right.
I should say mother, because that's what she really is. She's not really a queen. Whereas if the colony itself can smell fear, basically, right? So
Right.
those fresh queens that are not confident and established and big enough, they don't have the egg laying power basically yet, so they're not as well accepted. I wanted to say hi to, I think I mentioned Lolly earlier. I was saying hi to people on YouTube as well. I wanted to say hi to everybody that was always joining us and asking those questions. You're always welcome to bring any kind of questions tonight. The theme was honeybee diseases. So we went through a few of them, and Les's recommendations on what to do and what we do in our cases anyway. I want to say hi to, again, Monty from Suburban Southbuster, Bruce Rodriguez from Swampstead Bees and Gardening. Lolly was here. She's one of our apprentices. James Arnold's, the two of them. And Tasha, she's also one of our apprentices. And everybody here on YouTube. I love seeing everybody joining and asking questions. We really appreciate you guys. We hope that this was a really good episode, even though I don't feel really clear right now. Les had to carry the bulk of it, as he's usually doing anyway, but I wanted to thank you, Les, for your time tonight. And
thank you, Natalie. I can tell when you're thinking French and trying to translate.
Yeah, well, there was Roland Deschamps is on YouTube. That's a screen name maybe, but that's a French name, so my brain is kind of switched to French a little bit, and yes, it makes it harder. And when I'm cold.
Thank you all for setting it up, and I will see you all next week. We'll see you, Richard, and everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.
We will. Thank you very much. We appreciate you. Have a good holiday season. Merry Christmas to those of you who celebrate Christmas, and everybody else have the best holidays possible. Thank you so much.